Imagine your nightmare neighbor turning your prized garden into her personal shortcut until you unleash a revenge so epic, it traps her in her own arrogance and changes everything. I swear I had never screamed so loud in my life until that morning when Karen's SUV came flying over my hedge like a monster truck at a demolition derby. Coffee in one hand, phone in the other, grinning as if destroying my garden was part of her daily workout routine. And before I could even blink, branches snapped, dirt exploded in the air, and my prized rose bush, the one I had nurtured for 5 years, was flattened under her tires while she honked twice as if to say thanks for the shortcut, leaving me standing there in my robe, clutching my mug, feeling like the world's biggest fool, forever thinking she'd stop. That image burned into my brain like fire, my jaw locked, my blood boiling with a fury I had never felt before. And in that instant, with neighbors peeking through blinds, and me standing on my ruined lawn, I silently promised myself this war had just begun, and Karen would regret the day she decided my hedge was her personal driveway. That morning spiraled from absurd to infuriating in seconds as I bolted barefoot toward the crushed hedge, yelling words that would make sailors blush, only to have Karen roll her window down halfway and casually tell me I shouldn't plant things so close to the road before speeding off and disappearing around the corner, leaving behind tire tracks, flying leaves, and a neighborhood full of stifled laughter at my expense. The rage and humiliation tangled in my chest, making it impossible to breathe normally as I stared at the mess, replaying every smug second of her face in my mind. And it hit me that this wasn't the first time, not even the 5th time. It was the daily routine now. Her free ticket to save 2 seconds by cutting through my yard because apparently stop signs and street etiquette only apply to lesser beings than Queen Karen. I had tried kindness before, leaving polite notes on her windshield, asking her to stop, only to find them crumpled in my mailbox later. I had tried logical arguments, explaining how much money and time I had put into that hedge. But Karen had this uncanny ability to twist logic into a pretzel, laughing and saying, if I loved my plants so much, I should chain them down. Every attempt at diplomacy had failed, leaving me standing on my porch each morning watching my hedge die a little more, my sanity fraying thread by thread, until that morning finally snapped something in me. Later that day, after cleaning up the carnage and feeling the weight of another loss, I sat on my porch, staring at the empty space where greenery once stood, a burning ember of revenge slowly growing in my gut. Neighbors wandered by pretending to sympathize, but I caught their smirks, their whispered bets about when I'd lose it for good, and it only fueled my determination. I decided I wasn't going to play defense anymore. Karen had turned this into a sport, and now it was my turn to change the rules. But as the sun dipped lower, 1,000 half-baked schemes ran through my mind, each crazier than the last. What if I parked my own car there to block her? She'd probably ram it without blinking. What if I installed a fake spike strip? She'd laugh and keep driving. What if I recorded everything and called the cops? They'd likely say it was a civil dispute and do nothing. No, none of that would stop a woman like Karen. She thrived on chaos, on knowing nobody could touch her, on watching me lose my cool while she sipped her overpriced latte and rode off into the horizon. I needed something ironclad, a plan so airtight, so deliciously diabolical that not only would it stop her, but it would make her think twice before ever pulling a stunt like this again with anyone. That night, I barely slept, my mind replaying the morning's destruction over and over until I found myself imagining her SUV screeching to a halt, tires punctured, horn blaring as poetic justice finally arrived. My imagination turned into sketches on a notepad, crude drawings of barriers, trenches, and deterrents that ranged from mildly inconvenient to full-blown medieval traps. Every idea felt too small or too risky. But one thought kept returning like a beacon in the dark. The problem wasn't just Karen's car. It was Karen's arrogance. And the only way to win was to hit her pride where it hurt most, to outsmart her so completely she'd never recover from the humiliation. As dawn crept in, I was back outside, staring at my hedge like a general surveying a battlefield, seeing not just plants, but the front line of a war I hadn't asked for, but now had no choice but to fight. Karen thought this was overgrown shrubbery. To me, it had become sacred ground, and after what she did, I was ready to weaponize every inch of it. My hands clenched as I swore to myself this was the last time she'd get away with it. The next time Karen's SUV crossed that line, it wouldn't just crush leaves. It would trigger the first strike of a plan so flawless, so brilliantly cruel, that the entire neighborhood would remember the day Karen's reign of terror ended not with a whimper, but with a bang loud enough to shake every entitled thought from her smug little head. The morning after my vow of revenge felt heavier than any Monday I had ever faced. Not because of work or bills, but because every time I looked out the window, I saw those mangled branches like an open wound, a daily reminder that Karen had won again, and it burned me alive inside. I drank my coffee with a kind of grim determination, watching for her SUV like a hunter stalking prey, knowing deep down that if I didn't strike back soon, I'd lose what little respect the neighborhood still had for me. I could almost hear their whispers floating through the picket fences, the murmured bets on whether today would be the day I finally lost it and threw a rock at her car, or whether I just stand there helpless like always. The truth was I'd been helpless for far too long, letting Karen's twisted little game eat away at my sanity. But that ended now. By mid-morning, I was outside pacing the property line, measuring distances, imagining every possible angle she could take to cut across my lawn again. And each scenario made my blood boil hotter. She wasn't just driving over a hedge. She was driving over my dignity, my hard work, my peace of mind. And every time she did it, she seemed to grow bolder like a queen ruling her self-declared kingdom of asphalt and stolen shortcuts. I replayed yesterday's humiliation, my robe flapping in the wind as she sped off laughing. And it fueled me enough to grab a notepad and start sketching real plans this time, not just wild fantasies. I wanted deterrence, traps, psychological warfare if necessary. Anything to make her realize that cutting through my yard would cost her more than she was willing to pay. My first idea was to line the hedge with bricks hidden under the soil so her tires would take the beating. But the more I thought about it, the more I knew Karen wouldn't stop until she saw blood. Figuratively, of course, she thrived on confrontation. Loved every moment of me storming out to yell while she mocked me. I needed something that would turn the tables, make her the one humiliated, the one scrambling for excuses, the one being laughed at by the entire neighborhood for once. But revenge wasn't my only problem. As I plotted, I noticed other subtle damages I'd never fully seen before. Patches of grass permanently scarred by her tires. A garden gnome decapitated and lying forgotten by the fence. Even the corner of my mailbox dented slightly from where she'd clipped it one too many times. This wasn't a single act of disrespect. It was months of war crimes against my property, and my rage hit a new level where doing nothing felt like a crime against myself. Around noon, I decided to test a few deterrents. I planted temporary poles with bright flags where the hedge used to be, hoping the visual reminder would at least make her pause. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't wired to respect warnings. Sure enough, as if summoned by the universe to prove my point, her SUV came barreling around the corner a few hours later, music blasting, and she swerved only slightly, just enough to make it look like she noticed my effort before still shaving a chunk off my lawn, leaving the flags trembling in the wake of her passage. My jaw dropped, fists clenched so tight they hurt, and I felt this twisted mix of disbelief and awe at how brazen she was. This wasn't carelessness. This was deliberate mockery. She wanted me furious. She wanted me helpless. That moment cemented my plan. This wouldn't be a polite neighborhood squabble anymore. It would be all-out war, and I was going to fight smart. I spent the rest of the day gathering intel, talking casually to neighbors who had witnessed her antics, collecting their stories of near misses and minor damages they'd suffered, too. Turns out Karen had a history of using private property as her personal shortcut, leaving a trail of frustration wherever she went. But nobody had ever dared to challenge her because, as they put it, Karen always wins. That phrase repeated in my mind like a taunt, and I made a silent promise that for once Karen would not win. I went online researching property laws, booby trap legality, and defensive landscaping. I learned exactly where my boundaries started and ended, how much force I could legally use to protect my property, and the endless creative ways other people had dealt with nightmare neighbors. My ideas evolved from passive barriers to active deterrence, something Karen couldn't ignore or bulldoze through without real consequences. The more I read, the more a particular image burned into my imagination. Steel spikes hidden beneath the hedge, invisible to the eye, waiting patiently for her arrogance to lead her straight into her own downfall. The thought of her SUV coming to an abrupt catastrophic stop, the shriek of tearing rubber, the look on her face when she realized her reign of terror was over, it fueled me like nothing else. But beyond the fantasy of justice, I planned every detail with precision. I thought about weight distribution, tire pressure, how to place the spikes so they'd only activate if a vehicle, not a person, ran over them, keeping myself legally protected while still delivering maximum satisfaction. Every time I imagined Karen trying to bluff her way out of responsibility afterward, my resolve hardened. She had made me a laughingstock, ruined something I loved, and spat on every attempt I made to coexist peacefully. Now it was my turn to teach her that actions have consequences. Consequences sharp enough to slice through even the thickest layer of entitlement. That night, as I stood in my yard staring at the moonlight path where her SUV usually trespassed, I pictured tomorrow or the next day when Karen would think she'd won yet again, when she'd take that same smug shortcut like always, only to find out that for once she had underestimated me. The hedge war was no longer just a fight over plants and property lines. It had become a battle for respect, a war of wills, and I was preparing to end it in one strike that would flip the entire neighborhood's perception of who was truly powerless in this fight. I smiled for the first time in days, a dark knowing smile, because I wasn't the helpless homeowner anymore. I was the architect of Karen's incoming nightmare. And once my plan was in place, nothing could save her from it. The day I began transforming my yard into a fortress of poetic justice felt like crossing a line I could never return from. But it also felt like the first breath of fresh air after being suffocated for months by Karen's relentless bullying. The morning sun stretched across the lawn like a spotlight on a battlefield. And I stood there with my plan burning bright in my mind, steel spikes gleaming in my imagination, promising the kind of retribution that would make the whole neighborhood gasp. I spent hours pacing, mapping out the exact route Karen always took when she cut through my hedge, analyzing every tire mark she'd left behind, every pattern in the destruction she caused, until I knew the path of her arrogance as well as I knew my own driveway. It had to be precise. It had to be invisible. And most importantly, it had to be undeniable when it finally happened, so that even Karen, queen of excuses and finger-pointing, couldn't worm her way out of the blame she so richly deserved. The hardware store clerk probably thought I was building a medieval torture device when I bought heavy-duty steel spikes, reinforced planks, and camouflaging soil covers. But I just smiled and said I was working on some landscaping upgrades. If only he knew. Back home, I crouched by the hedge, working with a focus I hadn't felt in years, hands steady as I set each spike at the perfect angle, just low enough to stay hidden under the leaves and dirt, but sharp enough to tear through rubber like paper the moment her tires rolled over them. My heart pounded with a strange mix of anxiety and exhilaration, knowing that one wrong move could either land me in trouble or ruin my masterpiece before it even began. The thought of Karen's inevitable tantrum played over and over in my head. The way her smug smile would crumble when she realized her SUV wasn't invincible. How she'd have to face the humiliation of defeat in front of everyone. And the thought made me grin despite the sweat dripping down my face. But I wasn't reckless. I tested everything carefully. Rolling a wheelbarrow with old tires over the trap. Watching them pop instantly with a satisfying hiss. The sound like music to my ears. Proof that my design worked flawlessly. I reinforced the base, double-checked the alignment, made sure it couldn't accidentally harm anyone walking by. This was Karen's specific vengeance, precision engineered for her arrogance alone. By the time I finished burying the trap, blending it seamlessly with the hedge's remains, my hands were blistered, my clothes stained with dirt, but my spirit felt alive again. For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting to Karen's chaos. I was dictating the next move, setting the stage for a showdown she wouldn't see coming. That evening, I sat on my porch with a cold drink, eyes fixed on the road like a sniper waiting for a target, the anticipation thrumming through my veins. Every sound made me twitch. The distant roar of an engine, the faint hum of tires on asphalt, but Karen didn't show. She was probably off terrorizing another neighbor. Or maybe she had no idea that her reign of driveway tyranny was about to end. I almost wished I could see the look on her face when it happened. Wished I had cameras rolling for every second because justice like this deserved to be immortalized. The next morning dawned quiet. The kind of silence that feels too calm, too fragile before a storm. I stood by the window sipping coffee, pulse quickening as I heard that familiar growl of Karen's SUV approaching from down the block. My breath caught as she turned the corner. Same casual arrogance. Phone in one hand, oblivious to the trap waiting beneath the hedge line. She didn't slow down, didn't glance my way, just gunned it like always, probably congratulating herself for another effortless shortcut. Then it happened. A deafening pop followed by the screech of metal grinding against pavement, and her SUV lurched violently to one side. Smoke hissing from shredded tires as she slammed on the brakes, coming to a crooked stop right in front of my yard. For a second, time froze and all I could do was stare, my coffee forgotten in my hand as Karen stumbled out of her car in disbelief, eyes wide, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The scene was so absurd, I nearly laughed out loud. But I bit it back, savoring every second of her shock. She stomped toward my porch, fury radiating off her like a heat wave, yelling accusations about sabotage, about how I'd attacked her vehicle, about lawsuits and jail time. But behind her, neighbors had started to gather phones out, recording the entire spectacle. This wasn't just my victory anymore. It was public theater. The moment everyone had been waiting for, and Karen knew it. Her usual tactics of gaslighting and bullying crumbled under the weight of visible evidence. The destroyed hedge she'd plowed over a dozen times, the path of tire tracks leading straight into my property, and now her wrecked SUV sitting there like the final piece of a puzzle that painted her as the villain. I stood calm, almost serene, explaining loudly enough for everyone to hear that I had reinforced my property line to protect it from constant trespassing, that it wasn't my fault someone repeatedly ignored boundaries and laws. The murmur of agreement from the crowd behind her was like a choir singing my triumph. Karen's face twisted, torn between rage and panic, because for once she didn't have the upper hand. She called the cops, of course, shrieking about vandalism. But when the officers arrived and reviewed the footage from one of the neighbors' cameras, the truth was undeniable. I had every right to protect my land, and Karen had no excuse for what she'd done. The cops left with little more than a warning for both sides to avoid future conflict. But we all knew who'd been humiliated that day. As her SUV got towed away with 3 flat tires and a ruined axle, Karen stood on the curb fuming, throwing glares like daggers, but none of it landed. The balance of power had shifted. The neighborhood buzzed with whispered cheers. People patting me on the back for finally standing up to the tyrant nobody else dared to confront. I watched Karen slink away. Her pride shredded as her tires. And for a brief moment, I thought maybe this would be the end of it, that maybe she'd learned her lesson. But as I looked into her cold, furious eyes one last time before she disappeared into her house, a chill ran down my spine. Something told me this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. No, this was only the beginning of a much bigger war, one where the stakes were about to climb higher than I'd ever imagined. I thought the spike trap would be the final chapter in my battle with Karen, a clean win that would leave her too embarrassed to ever set tire on my property again. But I underestimated her stubbornness and her hunger for revenge. The morning after the glorious tire-popping victory, I woke up to find my lawn littered with trash bags ripped open, spilling coffee grounds and rancid leftovers across the grass. My hedge coated in some sticky foul-smelling substance that clung to the few surviving leaves like a curse. My stomach knotted in fury as I realized Karen had slithered out in the dead of night to retaliate. Her idea of payback as childish as it was disgusting. As I stood there holding a torn pizza box dripping old grease onto my slippers, I could hear her laugh echoing faintly from across the street. A laugh that made my blood run hot, promising that the war I thought I had ended was only escalating to a level I hadn't yet imagined. That day set the tone for what was to come. A series of petty attacks that turned my quiet mornings into battleground cleanup. She called city inspectors on me, reporting fabricated violations about my fence being too close to the sidewalk, about dangerous hazards on my lawn, clearly referring to the spike trap that had been long removed after its success. She left anonymous notes in my mailbox threatening lawsuits, claiming emotional distress over her flattened tires, as if she wasn't the one who had trespassed over and over. The final straw came one evening when I discovered paint splattered across my garage door. A crude message reading, "Stay in your lane," scrawled in dripping red letters. The irony of it making me laugh bitterly as I scrubbed it off with clenched teeth. Each new act of retaliation didn't just fuel my anger. It sharpened my focus, pushing me past the point of merely defending my property into the realm of total domination. Karen had shown me that she wouldn't stop until she felt victorious again, until she had broken me down in front of the entire neighborhood. But I wasn't built to lose. I started strategizing with the precision of a general preparing for war, analyzing her behavior, noting her patterns, and realizing that every move she made was driven not just by entitlement, but by ego. She couldn't stand being humiliated, couldn't bear the thought of losing face, which meant the only way to truly end this was to crush that ego so completely it could never recover. I upgraded my home security, installing cameras with motion sensors that sent alerts straight to my phone, not just to protect myself, but to gather undeniable evidence of every one of her stunts. I built a stronger fence along the property line, a real one this time, reinforced with thick wood and steel supports that couldn't be knocked over easily. But I left one particular section deliberately lower and open. A baited trap I intended to use when the time was right. Because while I was fortifying my defenses, I was also crafting my next big move. One that wouldn't just stop Karen temporarily, but would deliver a blow so devastating it would turn her reputation to dust in this neighborhood forever. In the meantime, I fought back in smaller ways that made me laugh even as they drove her insane. I planted motion-activated sprinklers that soaked only her side of the lawn if she dared step foot near it, installed high-pitched sonic repellents that made standing near my hedge unbearable for anyone lingering too long. All perfectly legal, but maddeningly effective. Each time Karen got sprayed or jumped at the sudden shriek of the sonic alarm, I felt a flicker of satisfaction that reminded me why I couldn't quit this fight. But as weeks passed, the tension built to a boiling point, neighbors whispering about the feud like it was a neighborhood soap opera, bets being made on who would win the next round. The real turning point came during a city council meeting I attended to argue against Karen's bogus complaint. She showed up too, of course, dramatically playing the victim, pretending I was some unhinged neighbor out to destroy her life over a few innocent shortcuts. But then, just as she was about to win sympathy, one of my allies from across the street stood up, holding up a phone with months of footage showing Karen's SUV tearing through my hedge, laughing every time, even yelling, "Try and stop me," on one video. The room went dead silent as everyone watched clip after clip of her brazen trespassing, the smugness dripping off every frame. Karen's face turned pale, then blotchy red as she tried to stammer excuses about angles and misunderstandings, but nobody bought it. The council shut her down cold, dismissing her complaints and warning her about harassment, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of real panic in her eyes, a crack in the armor of arrogance she'd worn like a crown for months. That victory tasted sweet, but I knew it wasn't enough to finish this war. Karen would regroup, would come back swinging harder, and I needed a final act, something theatrical, undeniable, and so perfectly executed that she'd never recover. That's when the idea for the ultimate trap struck me late one night as I stared at that lower section of my fence, the baited opening where she always tried to cut through. What if next time, instead of spikes or sprinklers, I built a fortress around her? What if her SUV entered my property and couldn't leave? Not because of damage, but because I'd locked it in like a wild animal in a cage, trapping her pride and joy inside my domain for all to see. The thought of Karen pacing, screaming, begging, while the neighborhood gathered to watch her humbled in real time, sent a thrill of dark satisfaction through me like nothing else had. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming every ounce of dignity she'd stolen, about proving once and for all that boundaries aren't suggestions, and that even the biggest Karen can be outsmarted. I spent the following days secretly preparing, gathering materials for a quick-deploy steel gate, reinforced posts, and heavy-duty locks that I could set up overnight, planning every detail down to how I'd lure her into the trap. I wanted the perfect storm, the moment when her arrogance blinded her enough to take the bait and I'd be ready to close the jaws of my plan around her SUV like a bear trap. As I stood in my garage, surrounded by tools and blueprints, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This war had taken so much out of me, but it had also awakened a side of me I never knew existed. A side that refused to be walked over. A side that would make sure that by the end of this, the entire neighborhood would remember the day Karen learned the hard way that some property lines are not to be crossed. The night before my grand plan came to life felt electric with anticipation. Every nerve in my body alive with a mix of dread and exhilaration because I knew what I was about to do would either end this war once and for all or blow up in my face in a way that would make the spiked trap look like child's play. I spent hours in my garage assembling the pieces of my strategy. Steel posts cut to the perfect size, a collapsible gate rigged with heavy-duty locks, chains, and anchors that could slam shut within seconds once Karen's SUV crossed the threshold. Every measurement was checked and rechecked. Every bolt tightened like my sanity depended on it, because in many ways it did. This feud had consumed my life for too long. Turned my home into a battleground, my mornings into dread-filled stakeouts, my evenings into cleanup sessions after her petty retaliations. This was no longer just about a hedge or property lines. This was about reclaiming my freedom from the tyranny of a woman who thought the world belonged to her tires. I waited until the neighborhood went to sleep, the moon high and pale above me, my only companion as I carried out the pieces of my plan under the cover of darkness. My heart pounded every time a car passed, terrified Karen might catch me mid-preparation and ruin the element of surprise. But luck was finally on my side. Her house stayed dark, her driveway empty, meaning she was either out for the night or sleeping off the bitterness of her last public defeat at the city council meeting. By dawn, my trap was set. The fence had been altered to create the perfect opening where she always entered, an invitation too tempting for her to resist. But hidden just beyond it was my steel enclosure, ready to swing closed and lock her SUV inside my property like a trophy in a glass case. I didn't sleep at all, pacing the porch, nerves on edge, rehearsing every possible reaction she might have, from hysterical screaming to desperate bribery, wondering how I'd keep my own composure when the moment came. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the familiar rumble of her SUV from down the street, the sound that had haunted me for months, now becoming the drumbeat of an impending victory. I leaned casually on my porch rail, coffee in hand, pretending not to notice as she approached. But inside, I was coiled like a spring, every muscle tense. True to form, Karen didn't slow down, didn't glance my way, didn't even pretend she wasn't about to violate my property again. She just swerved through the gap in my fence like it was her God-given right, oblivious to the fact that this time the rules of the game had changed. The second her back tires cleared the opening, I moved. With one swift pull of the concealed cable I'd rigged to the gate, the steel posts slammed into place with a thunderous clang, chains snapping tight, padlocks clicking home faster than she could process what was happening. Her SUV lurched to a stop as she finally realized something was wrong. Her head whipping around, confusion flashing into horror as she saw the solid barrier now sealing her inside my property. For a few heart-stopping seconds, there was silence, just the sound of her engine idling and my own breath coming fast and shallow. Then Karen exploded out of the driver's seat like a volcano, shrieking my name, hurling accusations about kidnapping her car, threatening lawsuits, police, divine retribution, anything her furious brain could string together. I stayed calm, leaning on the fence with the kind of serene smile that only comes from months of pent-up frustration finally finding release. Neighbors started to gather like bees to honey, their phones out, recording every second because nothing draws a crowd faster than the Queen of Chaos finally getting a taste of her own medicine. Karen tried everything to save face. She claimed I had constructed an illegal barrier, that I had lured her in like a trapper baiting wild game, that her SUV had accidentally drifted into my yard because of a mechanical failure. But the more she screamed, the more absurd she sounded, especially as everyone could see the tire tracks perfectly aligned with her usual shortcut. Her car parked squarely in the middle of my lawn, locked in like a stubborn child refusing to leave timeout. The sight was almost comical. This massive SUV caged in my yard. Karen pacing like a furious zoo exhibit, hair wild, face flushed, every ounce of her inflated ego deflating in front of an audience that had long grown tired of her antics. I let her rant and rave for a while, every word another nail in the coffin of her imagined superiority, before I calmly explained that after months of trespassing, property damage, and harassment, I had taken reasonable measures to protect my land, that she had willfully entered despite countless warnings. And now her problem wasn't me. It was the locksmith and tow truck she'd need to call because I wasn't opening that gate until law enforcement arrived to mediate. The neighborhood erupted in laughter at that. People clapping, cheering, recording every second to upload later, and I knew Karen's nightmare was just beginning because her reputation was being shredded in real time. For the first time ever, the power dynamic had flipped completely. She wasn't the terrorizing queen anymore. She was the fool trapped by her own arrogance, humiliated in front of the very people she used to intimidate. When the police finally showed up, Karen was frantic, trying to spin the story as if I had kidnapped her vehicle. But the officers barely hid their smirks as they reviewed the footage from multiple neighbors showing her deliberate trespass. The conclusion was simple and brutal. She had no legal standing. I had every right to secure my property, and the only one in trouble now was her for repeated violations and harassment. As the tow truck hauled her SUV away, the steel cage still wrapped around it like a badge of her defeat. I felt a wave of satisfaction wash over me so strong it almost made me dizzy. For months she had made me the laughingstock of the neighborhood, driven me to my breaking point, stripped away my peace. But now I had flipped the script so completely that even Karen's venomous tongue couldn't rewrite history. This wasn't just a win. It was a public execution of her ego, a spectacle so unforgettable that I knew nobody would ever dare cross my property line again. Yet, even as I basked in victory, I couldn't shake a small uneasy feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. Karen wasn't the kind of person who learned lessons. She was the kind who plotted comebacks, who stewed in her humiliation until it boiled over into something dangerous. As I stood on my porch, watching her storm off, vowing vengeance through gritted teeth while the neighborhood laughed, I knew this war wasn't over. I had beaten her twice now, once with spikes and once with steel. But something told me Karen wasn't finished, that she'd come back with a plan of her own. And the next round of this battle might make everything so far look like child's play. For a few fleeting days, after trapping Karen's SUV inside my property and watching her stomp away, humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood, I felt a level of peace I hadn't known in months, as if the air around my house was finally breathable again, free of the constant dread of revving tires and the screech of brakes tearing through my hedge. My mornings felt almost normal, as I sipped coffee on the porch, basking in the satisfaction of a war well fought and won. But that calm didn't last long because people like Karen don't lick their wounds quietly, they plot. It began with whispers from neighbors that Karen had been seen having heated conversations with a man in a suit who wasn't her husband and wasn't a friend either. A man who carried a briefcase and spent a lot of time looking at my property from across the street. I caught them once when I was watering what little was left of my hedge. Karen pointing toward my yard with an exaggerated wave of her arms while the man scribbled notes and nodded solemnly. My stomach sank with the sick certainty that she was planning some legal ambush to make me pay for every ounce of humiliation I had inflicted on her. And the fear wasn't that she had a real case, but that she had the kind of shamelessness that could twist any narrative until someone believed it. A week later, the first threat arrived in the form of a thick envelope stuffed in my mailbox. A legal-looking letter accusing me of illegal entrapment, willful endangerment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Every line dripping with Karen's delusional rewriting of history. According to her fantasy, I had stalked and targeted her innocent daily commutes, laid deadly traps, and imprisoned her SUV in a premeditated act of cruelty, all because of my irrational obsession with a hedge. Reading it out loud made me laugh at first, but the more I thought about it, the less funny it became, because Karen wasn't above lying through her teeth if it meant winning. I imagined her storming into a courtroom, crocodile tears streaming, spinning tales of a crazed neighbor terrorizing her for months. And even though I had evidence on my side, I knew how unpredictable public opinion could be. But as much as the legal threats rattled me, they weren't the only weapon Karen was sharpening. One late evening, as I was closing up my garage, I noticed a fresh line of spray paint across my driveway, a crude message reading, "Hedge Psycho" scrolled in neon green. The next night, my trash cans were tipped over, contents strewn down the street, and I swore I saw the silhouette of someone ducking behind Karen's SUV when I went to investigate. It was a campaign of psychological warfare, little acts designed to make me paranoid, to lure me into losing my temper publicly so she could play the victim again. Neighbors who had cheered me on before began to keep their distance, worried that the drama might explode into something bigger, and I felt the isolation creep in like a chill. But beneath the unease was a deeper truth I couldn't ignore. Karen wasn't acting alone anymore. A strange black SUV had started showing up late at night, idling near her driveway, its tinted windows hiding whoever sat inside watching my house. Once I caught a glimpse of a camera lens flashing in the dark, and my blood ran cold, realizing Karen had escalated this feud into a full-blown smear campaign, collecting evidence for whatever warped narrative she was building. It made my skin crawl to think that after everything she'd done to me, she was still convinced she was the victim, that she could rewrite reality just by screaming louder and enlisting enough people to back her up. But I wasn't going down without a fight. I doubled my own efforts, gathering every bit of footage I had of her trespassing, every note she'd left, every act of vandalism, every witness willing to go on record about her reckless driving and destruction. I built a case thicker than any envelope she could shove in my mailbox, determined that if this went to court or the media, the truth would crush her lies before they had a chance to spread. Yet, despite my preparation, a gnawing sense of dread followed me everywhere.
Because Karen had a knack for chaos that didn't play by rules.
That dread came to life one morning when city officials showed up at my door with notices of multiple complaints filed against me. Alleged safety hazards on my property, disturbances of the peace, even environmental violations for the traps I had supposedly planted.
It was obvious Karen had pulled every string she could find, weaponizing bureaucracy to make my life hell. And though most of the claims were baseless, they still dragged me into endless inspections, hearings, and paperwork nightmares.
My home, once my sanctuary, now felt like a fortress under siege from all angles. And there were moments late at night when I wondered if she might actually wear me down, force me to sell, drive me out just to claim victory. Then came the twist I hadn't expected, one that changed everything. A neighbor I barely knew, an older man named Frank, who had lived at the far end of the street for decades, stopped me one evening as I was bringing in my mail. He spoke in a low voice, glancing around to make sure Karen wasn't watching, and told me that she wasn't just doing this out of spite or boredom. According to Frank, Karen had been making offers to buy up properties on the block for months, trying to assemble a package deal for a shady real estate developer who promised her a big payout if she could get enough people to sell cheap. My hedge, my land, my resistance had been a thorn in her side, because if she couldn't bully me into leaving or destroy my property value enough to make me desperate, the whole deal would fall through. Suddenly, every move she'd made horrifying sense.
The tire tracks, the laughter, the harassment, the legal threats. It hadn't just been about convenience or spite.
It had been a calculated campaign to break me, to turn my home into a worthless strip of dirt she could snatch up for pennies. The revelation hit me like a sledgehammer, turning my fear into a blazing fury I hadn't felt before.
This wasn't just neighborly warfare anymore.
This was corruption, greed, manipulation on a level that threatened not just my home, but the entire neighborhood.
Karen wasn't a lone nuisance. She was the front line of a hostile takeover. A snake coiled and striking for profit. That night, I didn't sleep. I pored over everything I'd learned, every scrap of evidence, every ally I could count on, forming a new plan, not just for revenge, but for absolute victory. One that wouldn't just humiliate Karen, but would expose her entire scheme for what it really was. She had dragged me into this war thinking she could win by sheer persistence, by screaming louder, lying bigger, playing dirtier. But now I understood the real game. And it wasn't just about a hedge anymore. It was about truth versus manipulation, justice versus greed. And I swore on everything I had left that when this ended, Karen wouldn't just lose the battle. She would lose the war, her reputation, her deal, her fake power, everything she thought she controlled, stripped away in one final devastating blow she'd never recover from. The final act of this war wasn't something I stumbled into by chance. It was the product of sleepless nights, clenched fists, and a determination that had been tempered in months of humiliation and frustration. A plan so carefully crafted it felt like a chess move 10 turns ahead of a player who thought screaming was strategy. I woke up on the morning of the showdown with a calmness that almost felt unreal, like the storm inside me had finally found its purpose. Every piece of fear burned away and replaced with the iron certainty that by nightfall Karen would never again hold power over me or anyone on this street. I had spent the last few days gathering every shred of evidence, every recorded video of her SUV mowing down my hedge, every instance of vandalism, every bogus complaint and retaliatory stunt she'd pulled. But the crown jewel was the revelation Frank had given me about the real estate scheme, and with his help, I had tracked down enough proof to make it undeniable. Signed letters of intent from the developer, whispered recordings of Karen bragging about how she'd drive me out for a payday, even screenshots of messages where she negotiated kickbacks for anyone who helped pressure stubborn homeowners into selling. The truth was a bomb waiting to go off, and today I was going to detonate it in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. I called a neighborhood meeting under the pretense of discussing the endless drama with Karen, knowing full well she'd show up to defend her crumbling reputation, convinced she could outshout anyone who opposed her. The gathering took place in a neighbor's driveway, folding chairs lined up, the whole street turning out because they'd been living in the blast radius of this feud for months and wanted to see the ending one way or another. Karen arrived late, making her usual grand entrance in a freshly washed SUV. A smug smile plastered on her face as if she'd already won whatever argument was about to unfold. She strutted up to the front, pointing at me, and launching into a tirade about how I had terrorized her, how I had trapped her car, spied on her, ruined her life over a hedge no one cared about. Theatrics as usual,
her voice rising, face flushed, eyes darting for validation from the crowd. But this time, nobody was nodding along. They were waiting. I let her go on for a few minutes, her words digging her hole deeper until I held up my hand and everything went silent, the anticipation thick in the air. Without a word, I turned on the portable speaker I had set up and played the first recording. Karen's own voice, dripping with arrogance, laughing about how easy it would be to make that idiot neighbor crack so she could swoop in and buy the land cheaper, boasting about the developer paying her under the table. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd and Karen froze mid-rant, her face draining of color as I moved on to the next piece of evidence. Screenshots projected on a portable screen showing her conversations. The documents linking her to the scheme. Video footage of every single trespass, every act of vandalism, every line she had crossed for months while pretending to be the victim. It was like watching a queen stripped of her crown in real time. Her bravado shattering under the weight of undeniable truth. Every desperate denial drowned out by gasps and murmurs from the crowd. For once, Karen had no script, no backup plan, no ability to twist reality when the entire neighborhood could see the truth laid bare in front of them. The developer, a name known but not well liked in town, had his own reputation tarnished in the process. And by the end of my presentation, there wasn't a single person left on that street who would ever believe another word Karen said. The final blow came when Frank, quiet old Frank, who had kept to himself for years, stood up and gave his testimony, telling everyone how Karen had bullied other homeowners, slashed property values, and sold out the neighborhood for personal gain. His voice was steady, calm, but every word landed like a hammer on Karen's crumbling facade. By the time he finished, she was shaking with rage, shouting incoherently, trying to blame me, blame Frank, blame anyone but herself. But the crowd wasn't having it. They turned on her in unison, voices rising, telling her to leave, telling her she had destroyed their trust, their peace, their community, and that she wasn't welcome anymore. It was a mob without pitchforks, but with enough collective disgust to exile her right then and there. Karen stormed off, throwing threats over her shoulder, swearing lawyers would rain fire on me, that she'd still win somehow, but it was hollow now. A desperate scream from someone who had finally lost the one thing she cared about most, power. Within days, official notices went up showing that her shady deal had collapsed under investigation. The developer pulling out to avoid scandal. City authorities looking into her bogus complaints and harassment tactics. And suddenly, the once untouchable Karen was facing legal trouble of her own. The SUV that had once been a symbol of her arrogance sat unused in her driveway, its presence a ghost of battles past, while whispers of foreclosure and lawsuits swirled around her house. And me? I had my life back, my hedge slowly regrowing, my mornings finally quiet again, except for the birds that had returned to nest where chaos once reigned. Neighbors stopped by to thank me, to apologize for not standing up sooner, to tell me the street felt alive again now that Karen's reign was over. The victory wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone she had tried to trample under her tires, everyone she had manipulated and bullied. One evening, as the sun set golden over my yard, I stood by the newly planted hedge, stronger than before, and felt a weight lift off my shoulders I hadn't realized was still there. Karen's house was dark, for sale signs starting to appear, her empire of entitlement dismantled piece by piece, until there was nothing left but cautionary tales whispered over backyard fences. The war had taken months, cost me sleep, sanity, and more anger than I thought a person could hold. But in the end, justice wasn't just spikes or fences or clever traps. Justice was truth undeniable and final, laid bare for the world to see, turning a tyrant into a nobody, and giving me back the one thing Karen had tried hardest to steal. Peace. As I sipped my drink on the porch, watching the last rays of sunlight catch on the tips of my recovering hedge, I couldn't help but laugh quietly to myself, a laugh not of bitterness this time, but of triumph, knowing that if anyone ever thought to drive over my hedge again, they'd think twice, because this street would never forget what happened to the last person who tried.